Hello, welcome to Nap Time again. I'm James Dilley. Today I'm going to be looking at thinning and the tools that you might use for thinning. Now I know I've used a variety of tools in previous entries into Nap Time, both hammerstones, antler hammers, abraders. I'll be going over some of those again, but particularly for the soft hammers I'll be going into them in more detail because with the thinning process, that's usually one of the tools that we think about, and it'd be worth spending a bit of time actually starting to get to grips with these slightly different tools. The typical soft hammer we might think about is something like this, a piece of antler. This is from a red deer, but you can use a variety of different antlers from different animals, from fallow, red of course, reindeer, roe deer, although they're better for pressure flakers rather than soft hammers. That you can also use Pier David or Seeker deer, which are invasive species to Britain. You don't just have to rely on antler though, you can actually use another material. Another material that can be used as a soft hammer is actually this, and it's actually a piece of wood. Now that may come as some surprise that you can use wood for flint knapping and actually detaching the flakes, not just a hammer. But this isn't just any old piece of wood. This actually comes from box, which you'll often see as hedges or perhaps small trees in the UK. But in warmer climates, so in France, Portugal or Spain, this tends to grow more commonly. In the UK, you might see it as game cover on estates for pheasants or other birds and wildlife. But the reason I can use box as an actual hammer is because it's really, really dense. Just like antler, they both have that similarity that allows me to actually detach flakes. I tend to just use this as a hammer for when I'm engaging in indirect percussion, but occasionally I use it as a direct hammer. These tend to work better on slightly grainier, chertier materials, so it's okay with flint, but I generally prefer antler. But on a variety of cherts or materials that aren't quite as glassy as flint, it's really, really effective. And as I said, popular in sort of southern and central Europe, particularly because you can create pretty much whatever shape you like. Whereas with antler, you are of course restricted by the shape of the growth really, because the only face you tend to use is the pedicle, the point that connects to the skull. Whereas, of course, with the wood, you could create this shape, or you can keep it as this shape, pretty much any shape you like. So there are pros and cons. As well as my antler hammers, I will, of course, need my trusty hammerstones and abraders. There are different materials. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you will almost certainly have a variety of different geology. And it's a case of just getting used to it really and just having a go with everything. I find beach pebbles are particularly good because they've usually been knocked around by the sea a little bit against other pebbles, so if there are any cracks in it already, the likelihood is they will have already been broken because the sea has pre-tested them for you. But certainly a variety of different hardnesses I find are quite good as well. This quartzite hammerstone is really hard, so it's good for taking large thick flakes off. This abrader is good for preparing edges alongside soft hammers, sometimes for some hard hammers too. And finally, this grey or much lighter grey hammerstone is quite hard limestone, and its softness is particularly good for detaching thinner flakes, particularly if you want to keep those flakes for other tools like arrowhead blanks. So now I've looked at the actual tools, I'll start to look at some flint. It's always important to try and first clean your flint of dust. You can say it's been outside and the spiders and other foliage has got to it. Very professional. But it's important to look at the flint before you even start hitting it to try and work out some strategy for how to get into it. And this is perhaps where people who are starting to get into flint knapping struggle, because they look at a big thick block like this and think, how on earth am I going to thin that down? Well, sometimes it's not just a case of trying to see a really thin single tool in there. Sometimes there's an opportunity to take flakes off that are thin and just simply see this as a core. Certainly when I look at this, those angles that are less than 90 degrees are certainly not there because it's over 90 degrees. They're certainly not there. I've got this horrible rounded edge here. And around there, it's a bit thinner. I could perhaps get a flake through there, but it won't go very far. However, there is perhaps an opportunity to get a flake through here. If I strike really hard, it might run through there, but I would have to hit it pretty hard. I think to get through this one, it's going to be a bit of a challenge, really. If I'm careful, I might be able to get some large flakes off that are themselves quite useful, but I might be left with something that's quite thin. There's quite a good opportunity here, for example. You can see how the angle is tilted down and it's relatively narrow, it's well under 90 degrees. So if I was to strike from here with quite a hard strike with my harder quartzite hammerstone, the plane of fracture should run through and underneath. It won't go down because the striking platform here is angled into the stone. So even if I struck outwards, that connection point is facing here, so the shock's going to run through. And hopefully it'll run through and take a large flake off there. Now I point out at this stage with some of the flint that I've got here, it's come from a quarry, and this flint has actually come from a secondary deposit. Almost all flint comes from chalk originally, but this has been eroded out of chalk at some point and has then ended up in a sand and gravel system elsewhere. So it may well have been knocked around whilst it was being transported in geological history, or more recently when it was being moved around in the quarry. So there may well be little cracks in there. I'll put that down for now and look at this other piece of flint, which is also quite thick. However, I think there are some more opportunities here to get straight into it. I've got an entire tilted platform here. I could go anywhere along here pretty much, although the angle's pretty close to 90 degrees there. And the striking platform is actually slightly convex, which will distribute the shock over a wider area. Either you want it flat or slightly concaved. So I'd probably leave that or even try and take a flake off from here to dish it out. If I look at this angle here, again, it's slightly dished outwards, it's slightly convex, but I could, because there is a little concave area here, I could get a flake through here. I think to make best use of this flint, it'd be best to take a flake from here, completely clean off that side, and then come back on myself and take a large flake off through here, and that should dramatically thin this down. And from there, probably some flakes from here, using that striking platform I first identified. Now that will all be through the hard hammer. What it looks like after that is where perhaps the soft hammers will start to come in, and I really don't know what it will look like because there may well be cracks in this, I might make mistakes, who knows. So I'll start on this one, just because it's closer, and see if I can make some use of it really. Of course, safety gear on, gloves, leg pad and goggles, which were decorating my forehead and will actually do some good now, hopefully. And see if I can get some flakes into this. And really shouldn't be too daunted by the thickness of a piece of stone like this. Really, you should see it as an opportunity. And as I said, I've got that nice opportunity there. I'm just having a look round to see if there are any other opportunities like that. I reckon if I strike here, it would have to be a very hard hit. I could get a very large flake from there. I can see there's possibly a couple of little cracks in here, but they may just be very superficial. I'll take a flake off there first with my harder quartzite hammerstone and see what it looks like really. So I'm going to tilt up that platform so it's facing the hammerstone. I'm going to aim for around about 1 centimetre into the flint roughly. It's braced against my leg, but the shock is going to go over the side, not through my leg, and it's nowhere near my knee. So I've hit it, and you can see and hopefully hear that it's really shattered, and actually it's followed part of a flaw that's in the flint, and that's why it's not detaching properly. And hopefully you can see that there's this line. If I turn it round, you can perhaps see that line that's running through there, and if I rub my finger against the inside, you can see the dark material, that sort of an oil that's been left in the crack there. I did say that there might be a crack running through this. Sometimes you can undercut these, and this is of course the problem with a material that can be quite inconsistent and has come from a quarry. So I'll carry on and see if I can get anything out of this, otherwise I just might have to move on to the other one. You can perhaps hear the sound change. With very little force, it sounds like that crack is running. Hopefully you'll hear that real sudden sound change. There we go, it's just gone. So there we go, we can see how that's split clean through that fracture line there. It happens all the time. There's potential there for a blade core or a hand axe. It'll take a fair bit of thinning. Fortunately, that's what this video is about. Put that to the side for now. But there's still potential here, because now I've got all of this tilted platform to work with. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'm going to keep it tilted up and keep going for those edges in pretty much the same way as I just described. So keep it nicely anchored, go for a strike. There we go. And this material underneath looks absolutely fine. So sometimes you've just got to stick with it a little bit, even if there are problems in the stone. It happens to us all. You can see I've started to clean off that surface there. And worst comes to worst, this could just be a good core to take some nice flakes off arrowheads. If I really was going to thin this down, one of the big issues is, of course, this lump on the back. If I pop my hammerstone there, you can see if I hold it on the side profile that this is really the thick area on the top. So I'm going to have to undercut this and remove it. So hopefully you're starting to gauge onto the fact that rather than hitting it in the middle and just hopefully just crushing it to death, you're going to have to approach from the sides and actually undercut it. You could come from this side, but you'd have to create a steep platform over here and undercut a lot of material. It's far closer to my right over here, and actually, although it's just cortex, it is nicely tilted. So if I flip it over, I've got that nice tilted angle there, and I could hopefully go right through it. Again, I'm going to aim for about a centimetre, centimetre and a half. And there we go. And that's cleaned off that entire area there. Decent flake as well. So if I reconstruct it, you can see that with that tilting angle, so I would have come from the other side, that tilting angle here, I've come down and it's travelled through and undercut all of this material from the bottom. So I'll flip that over just to try and help you make some sense of it. So it's tilting up this way, and I've come through. If that angle wasn't there already, I could have taken some flakes this way. So let's say the angle was over here, so it was more like a 90-degree angle. If I'd flaked through, those flakes would have curved underneath and then created that nice angle for me. And I could have done exactly what I've done. So there we go. That's taken a huge amount of material off. So I'll pop that to the side. So now this is already significantly thinner. I've still got plenty of opportunities. But I'm going to stick with the hard hammer for now, but I think I might swap to my slightly softer hard hammer, but use it in exactly the same way. In terms of problems I've got in front of me, I mean, I've got all of this edge here, that's fine, it's just tilting downwards a bit, and if I want that nice lens profile of a biface, I need the blade to come up. It should be somewhere around here, but we'll deal with that shortly. At the moment, I've got this entire edge here, which is what's known as an opposing platform. It's almost a 90-degree angle, there's two edges on it, and there's no nice flaked cutting edge. I could flake through it right through the middle at the moment, because this edge is just under 90 degrees, as you can hopefully see. However, I think it'll be easier for me to attack it at the ends and work my way into the middle. So what I'll do is I'll tilt it and just do exactly what I've been doing. So I've got that flake that's come off, and you can see it's curved under nicely. It's starting to eat into that material at the back. Go back to the other side. Take a bit of meat off there. And now I've actually got these two angles to work from. So if I take a flake off here, it will remove some material off there, in theory. A bit like that. So now I can flip it over and come this way. You may have noticed I was doing it in my hand then rather than against my leg. That's just personal preference. You can do almost all the work against your leg if you prefer. I just find you get slightly greater access if you hold it in your hand. Certainly for these sort of medium to light flakes. For heavy flakes, I'll go back to using my leg. So I've still got this part of the opposing platform here. It's a little bit crushed over here, but that should be easy to remedy. It's just a case of deciding where to go. I reckon I could go either through here or here. I'll put it back against my leg, just to make it a bit easier to see. And there we go. Gone through that crushed material and opened up that entire area there. So, I think I'm getting to that point where I might start to change over to a soft hammer rather than a hard hammer. I'll maybe take one more flake off here, but I'm going to bring in the abrader for the first time and just very, very gently, very little effort to actually just take off the very sharp edge here. Tilt it down and catch it. So it's about 2 millimeters into the edge, and that's cleaned off and sorted out that entire opposing platform there. Are there any other strikes with a hard hammer while I'm here? Or maybe one here just to get rid of some of this ridge. I think that'd be a wise move. So I'm just tilting the angle round a little bit. So the platform's tilting this way, and by taking that little flake off, I've just turned it back round so it's running directly with that ridge. And it's that ridge I'm actually going to try and use to direct the shock. If you turn over any of my flakes down here, you'll hopefully see that the shock that I've put into it is actually following that ridge. So I'll take this last flake off and then move over to antlers. So I'll tilt the platform up towards me, about centimetres depth. And there we go. It's flake snapped, but it has followed that ridge. There's another ridge here, but it's nowhere near as extreme. There we go. So, I think it's time to move over to an antler hammer. So I'll pop the hard hammer down for now. I may well come back to it, and it's absolutely fine to dip in and out with the hard hammer. You don't have to see it as absolutely set stages that you go through your primary flakes only with a hard hammer, and once you've moved into your secondary flakes you cannot go back to a hard hammer. That's not how it works, because the flint can change all the time, and actually you might get a better result with a hard hammer. So I've still, in terms of my main objectives, got this ridge line here to think about. There's obviously that ridge on the other side. I mean, maybe there's a spearhead or a knife in this that I could go for. In terms of making life easier for myself, I think if I'm going to come from this way, so flake through here, it'd be easier to take a flake through here. Now, why would I do that? Well, it's simply because if I get rid of this area here, which I need to, it just opens up this platform. It isolates it a little more, so it'll make it easier to hit. That doesn't make much difference with the actual contact. If I hit this perfectly now, then it wouldn't matter what time I took this off, but it just gives you a slightly greater chance of making that successful hit. And that's sometimes what you've got to weigh up, is you look at this edge here and think, what are the chances of me hitting that edge perfectly? Well, if it's perhaps a little risky, is there any way that I could make my chances easy? And perhaps isolating that platform a little more might be one of those. So I am going to go back to the hard hammer briefly, because it's right in front of me, and I'm going to take some flakes off this way, which should open up this angle a bit more. So now it's just isolated it, so it should be easier to hit. I'll go back to the abrader. As you can see, I'm being quite aggressive with it. I'm just giving it a nice straight edge. In using the abrader, as well as actually blunting the edge, which might seem a little counterintuitive, what I'm actually doing is slightly changing the angle. I will show you very shortly on the whiteboard, so hopefully again make some sense of it. But it's very important that for any edge that you're preparing, that it's clean. And by clean, I mean it doesn't have too many fractures in it, and you can see there's a couple here, but they're not at the edge, and that's fine because I'm going to be making contact with the antler hammer along here. There are a few little ridges, but they're nothing too significant. If you do notice you've got any serious ridges, then it's worth going back and trying to detach them either with a brader or a small hammerstone. You don't want your abraded edge to be too blunt, because remember, the flint has to bite into your soft hammer, and if it's too blunt it simply won't bite. So I'll go to my nice new heavy soft hammer. The contact's going to be slightly different now. Instead of me making contact on the top and actually undercutting material, so you might remember I would say I'm aiming for about a centimetre and a half or half a centimetre into the edge. That was a mouthful. This time I'm actually going to make contact with the edge itself, because as I said, the flint needs to bite into the edge, and if you're making contact up here on the top, it's not biting. So it is slightly different in that sense. There's still going to be a driving through action, but with a soft hammer, and certainly an antler hammer, it's really worth using a bit of wrist action and letting the antler roll in your hand or against the inside of your thumb a bit, because that last flick really generates a lot of extra speed, and speed is important here. The faster you can hit it, the better your flake should be, as long as your platform is carefully prepared. So I'm holding the flint firmly. I'm bringing it round to face the antler. I'm just having a couple of practice swings so I know where the antler's going to go through. I'm giving myself plenty of space. I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, and that's something that people often forget. If you find you're sitting right back in your seat and you try to go through it, you may well end up hitting the seat and damaging it, or catching your hand on it, and that's painful. I've done that a few times. So sit right on the edge of your seat so you've got nice follow through. You have to be a bit brave with it. This is fairly early on, but even right to the end, you need to be fairly brave. If you try and pull back your blow and don't let the antler hammer go all the way through, it won't be quite as good a flake. So it's best just to let it go right through. So I'll aim for that corner. There we go. First flake, not too bad. I'll abrade that again. It is worth abrading every time. That was a slightly better flake, and you can tell it's a good flake because it has that real crisp crack to it. I'm going to move up now. And you can hopefully see that's thinning it down quite quickly. So I've now got to try and drive a flake through here. I'm just checking the angle through here. So the flake's going to come through here. There's a bit of a concavity here, and I don't really want that. Flakes like to travel over a convex surface. So what I'm going to do is take a little flake from the bottom here so that it'll drop the topography a little bit here. So rather than it flicking upwards, it'll start lower and be far more of a convex curve. So hopefully you can see now that actually it's more of a gradual curve. Very little effort, but it makes a big difference to the way the shock travels through the stone. And this is where the difficulty in flint knapping can start to rear its ugly head. Because as well as having to hit it accurately, you've really got to understand how the fracture mechanics work. So that's nicely abraded, fairly clean. Hopefully I can hit the target fairly accurately. There we go, nice crisp crack. And if I hold it up, you can see that it's gone right over to the other side. Put the flake back and cleaned it right out. So that, I'd consider that a really good flake, because that has given it a really lovely flat profile behind it. If I could do a series of those over the entire surface, as was done with Solutrean points or Clovis points for any North Americans watching, this would be a really good approach, and that's exactly what they did. I'll see if I can do that with these two ridges now. So in terms of the platform, I've got a very little opposing platform there, but I can get rid of that by aggressively abrading, and it's gone. The angle's a bit too steep now, so I've got to abrade a little more, and now it's not quite so steep. For this ridge here, it's actually quite severely concaved, so to get round that, I'm either going to have to remove a lot of material here or perhaps approach it from this side, or leave it till later, we'll see. I'll take a little bit of material from here, just to see what I've got. I think that's going to be too concave for now, just a bit too risky really. And I'll go for this one on the corner. Now this one's gone right through, but it's taken the corner of a floor off with it. And as you can see, it's gone right round the corner. And you can see there's the two floors there. But it's not too bad. Certainly for something like a spear or a dagger, that's fine. And actually it's set up a lovely opportunity to get this ridge on the back. So I'll leave that there. And I think it's actually made life a bit easier to come this way as well. So I'll prepare this flake here, and then before I move on, I'll bring out the dreaded whiteboard to try and make sense of what's going on. So now, it's not concaved, it's actually slightly curved, which is what I need. Nice crisp crack, and it's got rid of much of that thick point there, and I've got another ridge to follow up that could go over. So it's certainly looking fairly good so far. I've got a lot to deal with over here, but it's very easy to deal with. What I'll do now is go over, as tempting as it is to carry on, hammer's waiting ready to go, I'm going to go over to the whiteboard to actually try and make some sense of what's going on here. So to try and make some sense of it, I'll attempt to draw what's going on. So I have my piece of flint here, which was a bit blocky, with a bit of an edge to it. I assure you I've not attempted to draw a rude shape here at all. You just have to imagine that this is a piece of flint. Both edges here, and certainly with this opposing platform here, are going to be a little bit difficult to break through. And certainly if I actually make it a little trickier for myself, put some kind of lump here, which we actually had on the piece that I worked through. So if there's a thin object in here, say it's something like that, with my fantastic drawing skills, there's certainly going to be a lot of material to remove and some angles to set up. I think certainly from here the best approach might be to use a hard hammer to come in, and again at this point, because I'm using a hard hammer, I'm making contact inside the edge, about a centimetre, half a centimetre, maybe even 2 centimetres into the edge. That will fracture through and curve round the corner. I'll rub that off so we can actually have a sequence that makes sense. I could actually abrade a little bit from this direction with the abrader and just slightly tilt the angle, ever so slightly. So now the following flake with a hard hammer is likely to curve a little more. And it's at that point I'm starting to work the angle, setting up for those later longer reaching flakes. Now I've got a clear concavity here, you can see it's riding through there. So if I'm going to undercut this material, it's going to have to be a very heavy strike. However, what I could do, sneakily, is actually take another small flake from here, perhaps not quite as low as that, try from up here, that would actually take off the extreme end of that concavity. So now it's almost a continuous curve. There are a couple of little concavities here, but if you strike at a deep enough angle, it'll undercut that and go right through. Now I can go in with a much harder strike that requires a much larger arrow, of course. So this would be upside down, and I'm going to flip it upside down to make more sense of it. And that flake should travel all the way through and curve round as they start to, and probably terminate about there, in theory. And that's pretty much what I did previously with that much thicker piece, although the angle here was already there, and going back to how I was mentioning you might have to set up that angle for yourself, that's exactly what I've done. So now, if I flip it back over, and remove all of this, and the arrow, actually make this a solid line because that's where we are now. I'm starting to approach that lens profile a little better. Now I could keep going from this point, now that this angle's tilted, I could go for a strike from here, and that'll probably curve there. I've still got this end to think about. Now this may come in from, because of course this is a 2D shape, from strikes from this angle, or in fact behind the whiteboard, so coming from this direction. But you probably could get away with getting a strike in here, so the whiteboard would be the other way up, and it would be a pretty thick flake, but it should come off. At that point, you can come in from here, and you could come in from here, and then do the same, let's see, from here. And we've still got this bit in the middle that we're aiming for, try and colour that in so it stands out. You can tell I was very, very good at colouring in at school. Terrible. And then continue with a flake from here, so flipping it over now, coming across, really starting to approach, arrows crossing there, really starting to approach this bit in the middle. I've still got a lot of thickness here, but this is where the soft hammer might come in, because rather than these thick flakes, I can actually start to use the centimetre or so at the edges here just to clip the edge, and they will go much further and remove material in a far steadier fashion, and the same from the top here. And eventually you'll go from that primary flaking stage, which I had here, into that secondary flaking stage until you've got your piece that's in the middle that you then may go into pressure flaking. Hopefully that makes some sense of why working these angles makes some sense, because you can actually start to set your path up to get into the stone. So I'll go back to the flint. I'll tuck that out the way so it's not distracting. So I'll go back to the flint. So we are at that lens profile, sort of, although, as I said, I've still got that opposing platform there. But I think I've got a lovely opportunity here, either side of that little fracture there and this one over here, to drive a nice thinning flake through there. And I probably don't even need to abrade it because that edge is already very, very thin. There we go. Thin that down. It has curved up and hinge fractured a little bit, but that's fine. I can easily attack that from that side and get rid of it. That's not a problem. So I'll go over to the abrader. I'm going to go from this side now, but if I go for it straight away, even if I abrade it, it's very, very flat. So to get the flakes to travel, I'll really struggle at the moment, and I'll almost certainly end up with hinge fractures or chattering. So if I go back and actually take some little flakes off, what I actually end up doing is ever so slightly curving the profile now, because I'm dropping the angle here. So it will have to be less flat. And every so often I'm just checking to make sure those flakes are good clean flakes, giving it a bit of an abrasion, but now it's far more curved. Get a bit of abrasion on the reverse, and then go at it with the soft hammer. And there we go. Flakes have travelled cleanly, almost entirely across the surface. Another end-to-end flake. Nicely cleaned it off. That's exactly what we want. Another one there. So a good use of the angles there. I've got this ridge here that I'm going to try and utilise. Braid on the reverse and actually isolate that platform a little more. So it's just in there. There we go. Not a massive flake, but it's just there to take the ridge off to make life a little bit easier later. And another one. Bit of an angle change just to drop the edge so it's back to being curved. So this face is looking really good at the moment. I've got a bit of a bulge here, but I can easily attack that from here. I have still got this issue to think about. So I think that will be coming up next. And actually, looking at it, as I said, this face is great, this side not so much. So a few flakes through here will hopefully remove this issue over here. There's a bit of a concavity here still, so I'm going to have to flake into that face to try and drop the angle so it's a bit more curved. And just check it every so often. Give it a fairly aggressive braid and then see if I can go through there. There we go, got part of it off with that long flake. It's travelled right through. I've got this flake over here that can hopefully remove it. I'm just going to check the edge as I go. It's usually good practice to check the edge each time you take a flake off. Hopefully that will do a bit better. And there we go. Still a bit of a ridge there. But certainly not as bad. So that surface and that issue is a little bit cleaner. Now I should perhaps point out, and this is almost a good time for the disclaimer, that if you're making thin objects, they can snap at almost any time because either you make a mistake or there's a flaw, as I found earlier. There may be more flaws in this, so don't be too disappointed if they break. Yesterday, before I filmed this, I had a couple of things that broke on me. They were glass, which is a bit more fragile, and for those that don't know that you can flake glass, I have addressed that in a previous video. So my next big flake, I think, is going to come from here. Bit of abrasion just to straighten up that edge so it's easier to hit. You might notice I'm actually using the side of the hammer occasionally. That's fine. Just be aware that you can end up wearing one side of a hammer more, which can make it a little trickier to use later. There we go. That ridge gone. A little more there. Oops. Not braided quite enough. Try that one again so you can see how it's just shattered a bit there. I'll go for that last flake. There we go. So, let's see what I've got now. I've still got this cortex at the bottom. Not really an issue too much. Don't necessarily see it as a race to try and remove the cortex. And certainly for many European lithics, by lithics I mean stone tools, it's not uncommon to see the cortex that has been left on tools. And it has been thought that the napper has actually left the cortex there to demonstrate that they've used almost all of the cortex itself. So I've still got a bit of a ridge here. I know the cortex has just gone, but it was a good opportunity to come back on myself. Whoops. I may change to my slightly lighter hammer soon because there's no point using a very heavy hammer for taking off light flakes. That can lead to mistakes or misplaced strikes. I think it'd be worth sticking to the heavy hammer just for one or two more flakes maybe, just because there's a couple of heavy flakes coming up and you can perhaps see this thick area here, so I'm starting to try and straighten up the profile. So I'll need to get a couple of flakes through there. Another end-to-end flake. There's one thing to be aware of with those flakes that go right over, an overshoot flake, is that they do actually take off a little bit of material from the other side. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's not very much. And you can see on this one, it does actually take off maybe ½ centimetre or so. I mean, you're left with a lovely clean flat surface, but it's just something to be aware of, that if you're close to that final shape, if you go for one of those end-to-end or overshot flakes, it can dramatically change the shape of it. So it's better to go for them at this stage rather than the final shaping phase. So I'm going to go for this edge here, move my soft hammer out of the way so you can see, and try and drive that flake through. And there we go. Like that. It did chunk off a little bit there, but I think that's just where I caught the edge just a touch, not too bad. I think it was worth it to clean off a lot of that ridge. Now I've got this ridge here to deal with. And there's an opportunity to drive a flake right through it, a bit like that. Ooh, that's a bad hit. So it's just stopped there, so I'm going to need to try and flake round it like that to remove it. So this is thinning out quite nicely. I've now got this edge here which I mentioned previously, so to bring that edge up here, so I'm going to have to flake through that way. I think it'd be worth me taking a couple of small flakes off, which will already start to drop the edge, just to curve this profile here a touch. I've actually gone on to the other side, because if I flake through here and the flake comes through and reaches this high point here, it'll probably hinge fracture across here. So if I take a small flake off here, it shouldn't reach any concavities. So hopefully you can see now, if I hold it up and flat, there aren't quite so many concavities. There's a little one here, a bit of a ridge there. Let's see if I can remove that. There we go, so the flakes should travel through a bit more cleanly. So I'll go for that. Bit of abrasion, not too much, on the reverse side as usual. Medium hammer, hold it nice and tight. And for those that are finding they're missing the target, you may be doing this. Try and keep the flint stable, because certainly if you're coming in with your soft hammer and you're moving the flint, and people seem to do it to move their fingers out the way so they don't get hit, but if you're moving the target, you're making life easier for yourself, or harder for yourself rather. You're essentially moving the goalposts. So this is starting to really thin out nicely now. There's fewer and fewer problems, and I usually find that in terms of the flint or stone or other material throwing up problems, you get to a point where it just can't really offer up many significant issues unless there's a really well hidden flaw in there. And certainly on a good piece of stone or flint, it almost just seems to roll over and give up really, which is quite satisfying. But that's often where you make a mistake. Hit it in the wrong place and the thing snaps in half. So this platform's proving a bit tricky, and that might be that it's a bit blunt, or sometimes you tilt it downwards a little bit more, you can get a better result, a bit like that. There you go. But it's best just to, if you're working through it and you come up with an edge that's difficult, rather than just continually bashing away machine gun style with exactly the same force, which isn't going to do very much, just take your time, check that you're hitting it in the right place, or perhaps change if you think it's necessary, as I just mentioned. And if you are going to keep going, just ever so slightly increase the power each time. Keep the accuracy, but just increase the power, and eventually it should go. So I've still got this angle here that's a bit of an issue, still got a bit of material here, but not too much left to go before this is a good blank for a spear or knife. Certainly when you're working at the tip or base, that's an area that you have to be very, very careful of, because if you hit it very hard, the shock will go right through, come back and snap it in the middle. So if you are going to work on the tip, which presumably you have to at some point, as I'm doing, it's best to really brace the opposite end up against your leg, because it allows the shock to go through your leg and not be absorbed back into the stone. If you're trimming like this, it's not too much of an issue, but if you're going for heavier flakes, I would thoroughly recommend bracing it against your leg properly. So I'm just going to go for these ridges here. If the flint could speak at the moment, it's suggesting that it would like to be a Slutrian point, but I don't believe in that kind of stuff, so it's just going to be what I want it to be. Though, now that I've said that, this is perhaps where it will go and snap in half. You can see this little area here could be an issue. There are the remains of a floor, or it could even be a fossil at the bottom. I'm going to have to be quite careful of that. If I can undercut it and just remove it, then that would be a good thing right now. I'm just taking some flakes off the reverse so that I can come back on myself and then attempt that undercut. And I know it's a bit awkward bracing it into your leg when you haven't done it too many times, but it is worth it because you have to twist your whole body round. And you generally can't generate quite as much force as sometimes you want, but I can tell you the amount of thin objects I've snapped because I haven't braced it, it honestly is worth sacrificing that weeny bit of extra power. So I'm just getting close to that fossil, or whatever it is. I think a good approach to get at this could be from here, potentially. Or I may just have to leave it. Be a shame, but you do see it in originals. So I'll take a few more flakes and do a bit more work in places on this, and then I'll probably leave it, because I'm starting to approach that point where really pressure flaking, or a combination of pressure flaking and final thinning, is coming in, and that's a whole different kettle of fish unto itself. So I'm going to have to be quite careful with some of these remaining flakes. I've got a little bit of a high point here. which I could potentially get from here or even from here. But certainly for the length of this session, I think it'd be wise to tackle the next stage at another time. So it's really starting to get to that point. It's a real shame about that little fossil at the bottom, but I reckon that would be easiest to get at with either an antler punch, a bit of pressure flaking, and a little more care and time invested into it rather than just rushing it now. Just seeing if there are any final nice little flakes that I can go for, just to round off and just to leave this in a semi-pleasing shape. Well, I think I'll leave that there for now. This is a good blank for me to attack another time, but you've certainly seen the whole thinning process, and you can see this is quite thin. I'm still looking at that little fossily crack at the bottom and shaking my fist at it because it's been badly behaved, and no doubt I'll spend the next 10 minutes while I'm having a little break, after this video is finished of course, trying to pick the thing off, but I'll approach it another time. So the things to remember really are to make sure your striking platforms are clean, that you're not just crushing the edge with your abrader, you're left with that nice clean edge. And certainly as you're trying to use this for some assistance, go back through the video and try and look at some of those edges that I prepared with the abrader. When I took off some small flakes, if I was coming across little ridges or crushed areas, I was knocking them off with the abrader. And try and remember when you're using your soft hammer, whether it be wood or antler, to allow that wrist action, that clean follow through, and you'll get a much better flake. And in terms of actually making contact with the point, well, that's accuracy, and that often comes with practice. So be prepared that you may well break a few of these. I still break them and make mistakes, and I've been doing this for quite a few years now, but certainly if you're getting into it, you will break quite a few as well. So hopefully you can see the flaking surface there, and the flakes have travelled through quite cleanly. The next part of the process will be for me to continue using an antler hammer, but with some pressure flaking as well, to really have some high control on the platforms. But I think I'll deal with that another time. I'm going to leave that there for now. The next and end of series for nap time we'll be looking at blade cores next time and going through the challenging part of the process for setting up prepared cores, working out the angles, how to prepare the edges, and how to use an antler punch to get those really long thin blades off. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye. Remember to subscribe as well.